#1. He was one of the co-founders from the original IGDA, and now he works at DeVry as dean. So please be very polite and very enthusiastic in welcoming our next speaker.
Yeah, so normally I work without a microphone, but since they're recording, we'll see if we can't find a good way to make this work. You tell me. Can you still hear me when I get this thing down here? Oh, wow. That's good. I anticipate two problems. One, this thing is going to give me trouble. Two, I practice and rehearse these slides on my own computer, and this is probably a different version of PowerPoint, so God knows what we're going to really get out of it. Also, by the way, when I did this, the first time it ran about an hour and a half. How many people here have an hour and a half? Yeah, I didn't think so. So I've been trying to trim it down. So I'm going to be a couple of places where I kind of step through the slides pretty quickly to make sure that we actually meet the under the hour time limit. So name is here, title. Let's kind of ignore the title. The real point is I want to talk about, and here we go. We're already starting with problems. Do I have to stand over here? So all of you have been in this case where you have to test your demo your software when it first comes out, right? You've been testing it works great, you take it to E3, and your equipment doesn't work. I think we just had that problem here. Are you going to be around?
I'll grab that.
Yeah, get somebody here. It may have to actually do it manual, just have to tell them to move it forward. Yeah, because it's not responding. I'm right on top of it, not responding. We have another option. I have one of my own, but automatically. Okay. And I'll just hold on to this. Give me something to do. All right, so let's get into this because we're already burning daylight. Okay, so what I want to do here is kind of peel back the onion on some information. And by that I mean I'm going to start by talking about the basics. I'm going to cover things that you've probably already heard before. And we're going to cover, organizations, communications within organizations, and project management as it relates to the game industry, but also at a high level if you went and took a class someplace, how you might, hear some of these things. Many of you have already probably done this. So the first part, you're going to say, okay, heard that before. And then I want to go through, but it will put us all kind of at the same location, where I'm coming from. A couple of places I'm going to leave the reservation and have kind of my own definition for things. I'll try to identify that. So also, I didn't do much in the way of giving a bio because, this was more information. It's more about the information about me. But as I rehearsed it, I realized a lot of places I'm referring to my own, my own history, my own experience with this. And you may have some questions about, well, what is your qualifications for talking about this, or where is this coming from? So really quickly, I'll give you kind of the thumbnail version of my background. And that is, first of all, I'm a retired Air Force officer, which has nothing to do with game design, except that while I was still in the military, I did my first game. That was 1980, and I'd been a computer hobbyist. It was no computer gaming at that time, so I was a gamer, I guess, board game gamer. And I had a personal computer since 1976. And I just merged those two and did a game for SSI with two other guys called Tigers in the Snow, and it was basically a computerized version of the Battle of the Bulge, and it was based on my other interests. Then, while I was still working in the aerospace industry after I retired from the Air Force, because I was flying satellites for the Air Force at that point, doing satellite operations, I was involved in doing game projects on the side, helped start a company. I came down here to Los Angeles, which, by the way, is where the first meetings were held. It wasn't IGDA then. It was called Los Angeles Game Developers Group. It was a local meeting we had in 88, 89 when I was down here. While I was here also, I helped start a company down in San Diego, and I was involved in some other activities. And I've been to the first, game developers conference that Chris Crawford had, been to every one except the one they had in Long Beach. So I've been around the industry for quite a while. I worked as a technical director for a couple of years, Electronic Arts, actually twice. I was there one time, then went to EA.com. I was the chief technical officer at a startup, which, can mean anything. If you've ever been in a startup, you know how that works. And I've done consulting in the industry, and I worked for Adobe for a while, another story completely. So I've been kind of around the block, and when I was at EA as a technical director, I had the advantage of seeing lots of projects. At one point, I had 50 SKUs I was responsible for that were either in the incubation stage or in the finaling stage. But 50 SKUs, that was, I think, the max, and I felt a little overworked at the time. But that experience, along with the fact that now I've been at DeVry for 5 years as the dean of the game and simulation programming program, I see projects start and finish every 4 months. So, well, I'd say even more than that. We have 2 months, they're 8-week semester or sessions, and a 4 months semester. So I see projects actually start and finish every 2 months, and there's usually more than one. So now, granted, student projects are not the same kind of projects. They're not the same size. They're not the same scope. But it's amazing how, actually, when you see people who don't really know how to do projects, haven't worked on them before, when you see them make mistakes, they're clear. They're right in front of you. They're right in your face. Where when they happen on projects you're working on longer, sometimes they're more subtle. They're not as easy to distinguish. So I'm going to kind of draw upon some of that experience. So that's where this is all coming from. All right, so let's start with organizations. First of all, simplest organization in the world, one person. All you have to do is talk to yourself, not a lot of communications problem. Also not really interesting. So not good a chance I'm going to write a book called, Project Management for a Team of One. So let's move on to something more interesting. Next one. Okay, so now we got 4 people here. Now, what distinguishes these 4 people? Well, they're not 4 people, there's 4 blue dots on the screen, but what distinguishes them from just 4 random dots? And what distinguishes them, makes them an organization, is they're working towards a common goal. They're not just, 4 people walking out on the street. And they need to talk to one another. So with 4 people, we have basically 6 communication links. You've probably seen this before, right? It's the communication structure. So what happens if we up it to 11? Begins to look a little bit like a spider web. Ever played cat in the cradle? It's kind of what this looks like. All of those lines indicate communication channels. People need to talk to one another. And every one of those has a cost. When people have to talk to one another, it's going to cost you something. It costs time, if nothing else. So when all these guys have to talk to one another, it decreases the effectiveness of that organization. So there's some interesting things I can talk about with just nothing here but lines and dots or lines and circles. But if you take these 11 people, let's say that they were all equal. You have a task that needs to be done. Any one of those, and every one of those, could do each of those tasks equally. So, in theory, in theory, what would happen is you basically could say, well, if I took one person and they did this task, in theory, it would take 11 times longer. But in practice, actually, 11 people working on this can't get it done in 1/11 of the time because of the communication cost. It doesn't take as long to communicate with yourself as it does when you have 10 other people you have to talk to. So 11 people are not as effective as far as the actual work done because of the time lost for communications. So this would tell you that maybe the whole idea of having people work in a group isn't a good idea. But we know that's not true. And why is it? Well, it's because our assumption is wrong. We don't have 11 people up here all with the same skills and all able to do this job equally. What we have is people up here that are doing jobs that are all different and they have different skill sets. So I will hypothesize that there is, for any group of 11 people in any job, a configuration that's optimum. If you put the right people in the right spots, you're going to get the best performance. Now, what that performance is going to vary upon the job and upon the people, but you're going to get that performance, which means that if you take any one of them, and let's say you take all 11, give them the same job, the time it takes them to finish, the very fastest one will still be 11 times longer than all 11 of them working together. Anybody having trouble following where I'm going with that, the logic with it? It's because you get the speed of people doing the right thing at the right time, which is intuitive. It should just be intuitive. If you've got the right people in the right places, the organization is going to work better. So that's one of the first keys. You have to have the right people in the right jobs, and that's how you get the benefits of an organization. The other thing is the really final telling factor is there are jobs that you pick somebody out of a crowd, they can't do it. In the game industry, you have people that is there one individual who could do Halo or StarCraft 2 or something? Because there's art that's required, there's writing that's required, and trying to find all the skill sets that went into making a game like Halo, or take your favorite game. You can't find a person that has all those skills. So it isn't they just can't finish it even 1/11th or whatever the number is in time. They just couldn't finish it. So that's the other reason why groups are better than individuals, especially when you're working on larger projects. Okay, so and why to get this benefit though, you have to do two things. You have to have the right people in the jobs, and you have to figure out a way to control this communication cost. So let's take a look at the next, which is kind of the classic way you solve this. This is an org chart. Now, in theory, we've reduced those 55 links down to 9. So fewer communication channel, it's got to be less cost. Well, this is part of that onion. At some point, we're going to have to peel this away and realize that this doesn't really tell the whole story. But this is a good, kind of a good model and a good way to organize so that you can begin to get that efficiency. So to talk about some of the ways of why this isn't the whole story, I need to talk about, let's take a look at the next one. Need to talk about these three elements. Now, here's where I go off the reservation just a bit. Most of you have heard the discussion leadership versus management, that they're not the same, but although one person may have both jobs, you have to be a leader and a manager, you need to know the difference. I find for me, and I'm not saying they're wrong, I'm just saying that for me, it's easier to think of these as three things, not two. There's leadership, management, and supervision. And the way I structure this in my own mind is the leader is the person who sets the goal. They're the vision. They may be the vision creator. Steve Jobs, great visionary, basically he created it. He had a vision, and that was the vision for Apple. And and then he communicated that and they executed it. Other companies, that vision comes up from the company by consensus. But the guy at the top says, "Okay, I've got this smorgasbord of visions, and I'm going to take one from column A, one from column B, and I put it on the plate. And this plate, this is our vision. This is where the company is going." And that's done usually by the CEO. That's the vision keeper. That's a leadership effort. Now, does only the CEO have a leadership responsibility? So no. Everybody has functions which are, fall into the realm of leadership. For example, once the goal is set and the vision has been communicated down, then you have this case of, well, the vision is communicated down, but it's not complete. I know what my group needs to do, but I need to determine how we're going to accomplish that. Now, that's not what I'm going to get to in a second. That's not a management function. That's a function where you have to come up with your own vision of how you're going to accomplish the higher level vision. So there's a hierarchy there, but that's still, I consider that a leadership activity. So for management, management is about communications. And that's, I separated here from the supervision because I think it makes it clearer to talk about some problems that come up or to analyze problems that come up in an organization. When you think about that management structure, remember that org chart, that those lines going down are communications lines in which the vision that's been created at the top, the vision keeper has a vision and now needs to get that vision down to the bottom. By the way, in that chart, all those things at the bottom, those guys are the people who are doing the people in the trenches who are doing the work. In most organizations, they literally are the workers, and everybody above that is overhead. In the game industry, I've found that's not so true. In the game industry, as you go up that management structure, those people are also doing productive things and getting the game out. So when you hear people talk about management and management structures and span of control and stuff, that works for, and trying to reduce the overhead, that works for some industries, but for us, we have to be really careful about following that advice because upper levels is not just overhead. I mean, by the way, when I talk about overhead, it's not deadwood. I mean, this is really necessary. This is a necessary function. But typically in most companies, they don't actually get involved in building what you're doing. In our industry, we do. That goes up higher levels. So there are people actually putting in value-added material at very high levels, sometimes all the way to the top. So I don't think that some of the ideas they have about trying to cutting down the overhead with those layers of management, the underlying assumptions don't fit the game industry very well. So we do need, though, focus on the communications concept of this. You have to get the vision down so that people all the way down through the entire structure understand where the company is going, what they need to do to basically move the organization forward in the direction that it's supposed to be moving in, to work as a single unit rather than 11 people wandering off doing their own thing. So The next problem we have then is that if that was all, then you just need management. Once the vision was set, you'd have management in place, communicate that down. Everybody down in the trenches understands what the vision is. You know, the managers can go home. Their job is done. But that's not the only job they have in the way of communications. First of all, the vision could change. In the game industry, it often changes overnight. So that new vision has to be recommunicated down to the trenches. But the real reason why management has to be there all the time, doing management functions, is because communication has to flow from the bottom back up to the top. Because the guy at the top who has the vision has to keep checking. Are we really going in the right direction? Are we really doing the things down there that need to be done? And that information has to flow back up through that channel. So if there's problems either way, you can see there'll be symptoms in the organization where it says your communication channels are not working right. So the next thing we need to talk about is supervision. So let's assume now that the vision has been set, communication lines there, the vision has been communicated to everybody. Everybody knows what they need to do, but the job isn't getting done. Fixing that is a job of supervision. So there is a part of it that says, okay, for some reason, the people who are supposed to do the job aren't doing it. And if I'm their supervisor, you may be a manager, you may have another title, but you're supervising their work. If I'm their supervisor, this is a problem, I need to fix it. Now, does it mean if they're not doing their work, I need to fire them and replace them with somebody else? No, because there's a lot of reasons why people might not be doing their work. What if they don't have the tools they need? So, you're asking them to do something, but you haven't given them the right tools. You need to, as a supervisor, part of your problem-solving, skills and requirements are to figure out what is keeping my people from doing what they need to do. And there could be a lot of reasons, and I won't go into those because if you've had experience in that, you know that there are tons of reasons. But the thing is, there's a supervisory function, and you need to work on that. Maybe the problem is they don't understand the goal. I mean, they're trying to do the work, but they really don't understand what they're trying to do. That tells you that, okay, as a supervisor, I realize the problem here is communications. And now, so I step out of my supervisor's shoes, put on my manager's hat, and say, okay, is this a problem of communications? Do I have a good idea what it is? And have I not been communicating properly? If so, then I take that hat off as a supervisor, go back and say, okay, here's the vision. Whoops, wait a minute, that should be the manager's hat. So you get the picture here. There's various levels you're stepping through in your mind. And if it turns out it's, hey, I don't even understand the goal, then you go back up and say, boss, I don't think I quite got the vision because we're doing things down here and it doesn't seem to be working. So better explain it to me again. And he may say, or she may say, that, well, now that you bring it up, I guess I don't have a really clear idea how that's supposed to be done either. So you've identified something that needs to be done, you fix it, and then that's how you fix that. But the key here is, by breaking it down into these three levels, you can kind of step back and say, what's the problem? What hat should I be wearing to fix this, and where should I go? And it helps to kind of get the wheat from the shaft, get the noise out of the signal, so that you can really focus on what's going on, especially when you're really busy and things get emotional and you get tired. Sometimes it's hard to just take a deep breath and focus on what is the real problem here because you've got so many fires going on. Having a model to fall back on is a good way to kind of keep that straight. So let's move on to the next thing here. So you've got this model here that says we've got these communication links, the 9 communication links. But I said, this doesn't tell the whole story. It isn't like by organizing this way we have solved the communication problem. I mean, we have people now not spending much time in communication because, first of all, next step, there's some more communication going on here we haven't identified. Okay, and that is meetings. Meetings occur at civil, whenever you get people together, they're talking to one another. So those lines, there's cross lines there. So now we've upped the level. And furthermore, and you're going to have to hit 1. Okay, hit it again. So something is happening, hit another time, that also makes this even worse. And one more time, and now, finally, when I had my control of this, it worked a lot better. It turns out you have cross-organizational meetings. And that means, people are talking to one another across those lines of communications. And if you take this to the extreme, we're back to 55 links. So are we fooling ourselves about this organizational structure? Is it really not a good model? Is all this communication going on anyway? And maybe it's even necessary? Well, no. I think that still it's a valuable model because what happens is by having that structure, let's take a look at the next one. If it's not the one I want, yeah, we'll wait. So you can see this while we're talking. That communication, that structure we have actually identifies a formal level of structure. It sets expectations on where the vision is coming from. It sets expectations on how processes are developed. So all of those things reduce the cost of communications. And it makes communication better. So even though you don't want to get rid of those communication links because they are often necessary. There's the formal, the informal, and the semi-formal. Formal being those lines you see from the top to the bottom. Semi-formal being the intermediate meetings that happen, and the informal being, the water cooler discussions where people are talking about what happened yesterday. All of those serve a function, but all of them are potential places where you have to be careful that things can go wrong. And so let's start by talking, by my definition, of what communications really is. In my definition of communications, it's basically any information that is going into, out of, or between the team members. So you could be coming in from outside, it could be going outside, or it could be going between people. And you usually have several parts to it. Also, there's written, verbal, and visual. By visual, I mean body language is part of a communications, along with storyboards. It's another visual. But body language, if your boss is up there and he's kind of like this, and he's saying, well, I've got some concerns. That's telling you something different from, hey, this is really going on. Body language is actually telling you something. So all these forms of communications are there. Now, what do you lose in email? Not much in the way of body language, right? So sometimes emotional context gets missed. Email has a tendency to muddy up the water if there's subtleties that have to be communicated. So it's clear that different channels of communication, different methods of these have different effectiveness. But once again, it's not so much, we kind of hopefully instinctively choose the right form of communications for the right messages we're trying to get across. But we still have some things we need to worry about. Let's go to the next. Okay. So, it looks like my slides are out of order. So I will talk briefly about these, and then I want to get on to the meat of it. So there's symptoms. So these things are symptoms. I'll let you look at them. I'm not even going to talk too much about them because this is a place where I want to speed things up. You're kind of familiar with the symptoms. Let's move to the causes. Up the other way. Up, other way still. The other way. Okay, causes. These are kind of the classic definitions of some of the causes of communication. And I'll stop right there for a second and say, both of those, the thing to know is, those are symptoms of communication failures. These are causes of communication failures. But the symptoms were not the only, those are not, the causes of those other symptoms are not necessarily communications. There can be other causes. Just like these causes are, they may not be communications causes, like the message not defined. That may be the fact that the goal was never set. That's actually a leadership problem, but it has a communications component. So these are things that also, typically you don't have to have somebody give you a list like this, because if the message isn't getting through, you recognize, I said the message didn't get through. So, but I put it here just to keep us all in sync. Let's try the next one. And so here is something from my own experience I have found to be convenient. When I have problems, especially when I'm looking at communications problems, I look, are there patterns? You look for patterns in communication. Is there a certain time or a certain place or a certain group that seems to have problems with communications? If there is, it's probably worth my time to go in and find out what it is. And why is that? Because if it's a reoccurring pattern, chances are it's going to happen again. On the other hand, if it's random, then maybe I've got to just say, okay, I'm having random problems, but this is life, and I've got other fires to put out. Probably not high priority on the random communications errors. If they're constant and random, then I may need to go back and take a harder look at those. Look for a pattern somewhere in those random failures, because somewhere there may be a system failure if I'm having lots and lots of communications issues. And then finally, if it ebbs and flows, that could be. There's a lot of particular reasons for that. It could be that somewhere communications processes are fine, but they get overworked and then they collapse. So if you can identify that, this is a specific case, there'll be a lot of other cases, but you identify that, what you try to do is make sure they don't get overloaded or improve their mechanisms so that when they get overloaded, their communications processes don't fall down. Okay, so let's go to the one that I was expecting after that, talk about costs. So there are sender costs, which means the time it takes for somebody to create the information that's going to be generated for either outside or for inside. It's the time that takes. There's the reader time, or the time it takes to consume that information. And they're not the same. So a person writes an email in 3 minutes, and maybe somebody can read it in 1. But if you've got 10 people reading the email, so first of all, the 5 or the 3 to 1 doesn't match. And second of all, if you add up all the people reading it, that's 8 to 10 minutes versus the 2 or 3 it took to take it. Those things you can't, and what that really tells us is those lines between those nodes, it's not really a bandwidth. There's an outward band and inward band. And that sometimes you think, well, I've got this information, I want to send it out, and I'm just going to send it to everybody because it's email and it's easy. And besides, it's not costing me any extra time to do that. Well, it's not costing you any extra sender time, but consumption time goes up. Because even the people that don't need that information have to filter through it to say, oh, I've got to read enough of this to know I don't need this information. So there's something here that I want to borrow. I could borrow from the Greek philosophers and talk about the golden mean and all this, but I actually like to borrow from astronomers, and particularly ones that are looking for extrasolar planets that might harbor life. And they've coined this term called the Goldilocks zone, where the planet's within a range where it's not too hot or not too cold, and you can have liquid water. Well, my view of communications is it should fall within the Goldilocks zone. You need to have enough communications that the communications job is being done. People are getting the information they need when they need it, but not so much that it's beginning to drag down what's going on. So you don't want, if you can cut back unnecessary emails where you don't have to have people spending time sorting out, oh, this, I don't need this, this isn't important. Or you can clean up your communications channels and make them better. Or if you are writing documents that nobody reads, you should stop that. If you are writing documents that only a few people need to read, don't send it to everybody. Furthermore, if you're writing documents, for instance, we have game design documents, we have technical design documents, we have a lot of different kinds of documents that maybe we shouldn't even be thinking anymore in terms of documents. We should be thinking in terms of information. So if we have a game design, we need to think, what's the best way, who needs that information in a game design, what would be in the game design document, and what is the best way to get that information to them? So here's a story from my ancient past. When I was doing consulting, I did a job for, I won't name names or mention companies, but I was doing a job as a technical director it was a contract job for technical director, and the producer was going up to go to a third-party developer that was producing a game that was going to be released in conjunction with the release of a television series. And if I told you the television series, anybody here know about the game that was coming out the same time Stargate SG-1 was supposed to come out? Anybody worked on that project? Okay, so I can tell you it was Stargate SG-1. Not revealing anything there. And when we got there, they gave us their Bible. Now, this Bible contained a lot of things. One thing it contained, and this is before Stargate SG-1 had actually come out, so I'm really dating myself here, but in there was this thick document. It wasn't that thick, but this document, which was the Bible for the television series. Now, was this wasted effort or not? Well, no. First of all, because it was written for another purpose, and it filled that purpose, so it was already done, didn't cost a cent or anything. And furthermore, it gave the backstory. It gave people who were working on the game an idea of what it was they were supporting. Perfectly legitimate document, and it was actually probably pretty efficient because it was already written, already built for another purpose. But then we get into the main game design document. And I'm going to kind of do a little poll here to see if you see anything like this. Game design document, in theory, it was written to describe the game, and in theory, a game design document is what you hand over to the programmers so they can then make the game, right? Isn't that the function of a game design document? Well, this thing was filled with stuff that looked like it was also meant to sell the game. So it was a marketing document and a game design document all mixed into one. So it talked about how this is going to be a great game, people are going to love doing this. As a programmer, if I'm putting this together, I don't care how much people love it. I want to know, what is it I need to do? If I'm going to fund this thing, I don't care what it needs to do. I want you to tell me people are going to love it and prove it to me. So you have the need to put both those messages out, but you need to know who your audience is, and you need to make the documentation or provide that information to the people that need it and pull it out of those areas for the people who don't. That way you cut down the communications cost. So that's one way to kind of get around this problem of, you're overloading your people with information. So the next thing, I have another story. This is a good slide. Lots of stories on this one. So the next one is standards are a good thing. Now, there's been a long, ranging argument over, standards are good for us, standards are holding us back, and it depends on where they are. I'm saying that in this case, standards can be a good thing, and here's my experience that makes me feel this way. Doesn't make me right, just makes me feel this way. And that is that when I first got to electronic arts, one of the things we did as a technical director, we had third-party developers, and they were working on projects, and it was technical director's job to, I'm blocking the view here, technical director's job to determine if this team, had a good technical plan, and if they had issues, and if they were, we were to help them kind of solve them. And we did this through a technical design review, and we had a technical design document. But guess what? It turns out the technical design document was whatever they handed us. We said, 2-3 months, you're going to come back, give us a technical design document, we're going to go through a review, and then we'll tell you yay or nay or whatever the problem is, and maybe you need to fix something. So I did this 3 or 4 times. It would be a couple of days reading through this document. They were usually about so thick, and it varied. And typically there was stuff in there that we were looking for you couldn't find, and other things, and those would be flags. We can't find this, maybe we need to press them on. Did they think about, what is going to be the performance on the platform? What's going to be the minimum system? Who's on the team? What kind of experience do you have? Those are the kind of things we wanted to see, and sometimes it'd be there, sometimes it wasn't. If it wasn't, red flag. But it would take sometimes a couple of days to go through that, to figure out, to really give it the work you need to give it. And I kept thinking, okay, I come from the military. I flew satellites. Anything breaks on that satellite, we had a contingency plan. We practiced and rehearsed a contingency plan so that we had procedures in place, so we were ready. And because we'd only see the vehicle for about maybe 3 to 5 minutes, and then we wouldn't see it for another 90 minutes. We didn't have much time to react. In this case, so we had to make it as efficient as possible. And I thought, okay, we spent a lot of time ahead of time in the military doing that, but it really paid off. We need it. And right now, I'm seeing we're spending a lot of time on these technical design reviews, and I'm not sure we're even doing that good of a job. So I got together with the other technical directors and said, we need a template for a technical design document. So they said, okay, sounds like a good idea. Wonder why nobody's thought about it before. And since it was your idea, you get to do it. So I took the various technical design documents we'd gotten in, peeled the best parts out, put together a draft. We ran it around, the process of getting the consensus. We got a lot of good ideas, and we came out with what I thought was, and I still think was a pretty good template for the purposes there at Electronic Arts. Wouldn't recommend it for everybody, but for us, I think it was a good document. And as a matter of fact, our history with it was pretty good. What happened, next team comes in, they're lambs to the slaughter. They had no clue that this is the first time this had ever been used. So we go and they come in, they sit down, we say, okay, we're going to do the technical design review in 2 months, and here's the technical design document template that we want you to send to us as soon as you're done. No, didn't give them any indication that it was not something that was done all the time. And they looked at it, and it was about so thick, just the template. And the eyebrows didn't go up, but you could see they were kind of thinking, oh, okay. So they go off. 2 months later, we had the technical design review. We go through it. It goes through well. By the way, they sent the document in just before that. It took 20 minutes to go through it because we knew where to look for the issues. We knew what we were looking for. We were looking for the holes. Very, very efficient on our side. So now I'm wondering, okay, how about what was the experience like for them? So when it's all done and we're finished, I say, oh, by the way, this is the first time we've used this template. And what do you think of it? Expecting them to say, well, it was pretty wordy and there was a lot of stuff in there. And why are you asking for some of this information? But that's not what I got back. What I got back was, well, we loved it. And I said, oh, okay, why did you love it? Well, first of all, we didn't have to spend a lot of time figuring out what the format's going to be. Because, typically we have to figure out what are we going to put in there, how are we going to organize it. You did all that for us. So it saved us time. And furthermore, there was stuff in there we would have never thought of. And we changed our process because of what was there. So they were happy with it, we were happy with it, and that was, to me, an indication we'd made the right decision. So, and another thing that turned out was a benefit of that, as we discovered we had left things out, things that we had missed, where they'd come up. Project come through, something would go wrong. We said, we never covered that in the technical design review. It wasn't in the document. We added it. Next one that goes out has it in there. So quality control and quality improvement built right in when you have a standard document like that. So what did we really do there? What was the real solution we came up with? Well, we made communications more efficient. We cut down the amount of time it was required to generate and consume information. And as a result, it was more effective and it was more efficient. So this is a good way to test if what you're doing is the right thing. If the process is less costly, then you've done the right thing. So yeah, because you're going to need a test, because sometimes you're going to make a change and it's not going to be the right one. And then you're going to know because suddenly things didn't get better, they got worse. It may have gotten easier for you. It may have taken half of your time, but it may take 3 times as much time with the people that are doing it. And that's an overall loss. That's not a win. You can't look at things just from your viewpoint. You've got to look at it from the system side. Okay, so the next 2 are there because if I didn't mention them, people would say, well, wait a minute, these are 2 things for communications that are really important too. You should mention. Meetings need agendas. Anybody here need to have any further explanation of that? You've probably heard that so many times, meetings need agendas, right? Okay, we don't have to talk about that anymore. How about shotguns are for duck hunting? A little bit more obscure. Okay, so what that really means is that, and I kind of talked about it earlier, if you have information, don't just shotgun it out to the world. Make sure you target where your information goes so that you're not inundating, because people who don't need that information, this isn't information, it's just noise. And it's consuming their time. So, if you're going to use shotguns, save them for duck hunting if you're into that kind of a sport. If not, play it on the Wii, right? Okay, so let's try the next one. All right, project management. Anybody here another Men in Black 2 fan or Men in Black? Okay, good. So you'll recognize that this old and busted new hotness is from that movie. So just in case you think I'm a little weird, I am a little weird, but this I borrowed. Okay. All right, so waterfall method. Everybody here has seen these 2. Waterfall Scrum. It's been, we talked about it last year until we were up to here, right? And it's kind of been the big thing. I think at this point, there aren't very many people left that are saying, oh, no, it should be waterfall. Scrum is not the way to go. Isn't that, everybody here pretty much uses Scrum now, right? Who doesn't use Scrum in their organizations? Who doesn't use a waterfall? Okay, so everybody who didn't raise their hand doesn't use Scrum or waterfall, is that right? I've learned when I'm teaching classes that I sometimes have to ask the question and then ask the counter question just to see who's, really still with me or completely lost, So the waterfall, first of all, it was already obsolete when it came out. It had assumptions that kind of fit for some industries, but not for us. And for one thing, the old waterfall, there's 2 waterfall concepts, in case you haven't been keeping up, you probably have. But the original waterfall was planning, and then design, and then when you're done with the design, then you do development, and then you do testing, and then you do delivery. And that was all based on the assumption that when you do the planning, you can understand after planning exactly what needs to be done. And then you design to that. And when you got the design done, and then you just develop it. And if you're building bridges, and there may be some software, even there probably a problem, but some software things, like if you're building an ATM system or something where you can write a specification, there is a need that you have to fill the specification, then maybe this works, but even there it had problems. But for us, in the game industry, we don't have a specification. Somebody didn't walk through the door and said, I'm a customer, and here's my specifications for Tetris. I want you to build this game, and this is what I need. It's, this came from a game designer, and it was a piece of art. And more than likely, he didn't just wake up in the middle of the night and say, I've got this great idea. I'm going to take these birds, and I'm going to slingshot them through the air, and they're going to knock things over. And, of course, that idea will never go anywhere, right? It's a bad idea. Yeah, okay. How many millions have been sold? I don't know. My first reaction was, what a dumb concept. And then I played the game and was hooked. So anyhow, sometimes a person may wake up with that, with a creative designer may wake up and has a complete vision in their mind of what the game is going to be, especially if it's a small, casual game or something that's going to run on a platform where it's not real complex. It just hits them. And then maybe you can use a waterfall method, but even then I wouldn't recommend it because there's some other advantages to Scrum. But normally, especially in big projects, that's not the way it happens. There's a core concept, there's an idea, and then it grows, and more people begin to add into it. And you want to have an organization in which those changes can happen. Good ideas pop up. If you can put them in at low cost, this is what you want to do. Because The more ideas you can get in, you need to have somebody controlling where they come from and which ones go in and which ones don't. But you want that to happen because that's going to make a better product. And to do that with the old waterfall method, or even the new waterfall method, which is where they overlap, you have the planning and it overlaps the design and which overlaps the development. Even that system isn't flexible enough. That doesn't give you the flexibility that Scrum does. So our original assumptions were off, and we should have never used that. And quite frankly, that was one of my failures. And also, just like where I came, like we had the idea for the technical design document template, that kind of came out of my military background, and that was a good thing. Coming out of that more formal environment where we did all the planning and stuff first, I was a little biased in that direction. And I was pushing for more planning up front, And it wasn't until I had been there over a year that I was sitting in the middle of a meeting, and suddenly it dawned on me, I'm pushing for planning, but this is a piece of art, not a specification. And this is probably not the right model. And then I had to kind of do a complete rethink. But I had the same bias for a long time. It took me a while to recognize that this wasn't the right model. So now we're in Scrum. Scrum is the answer to everything. It is perfect. It has no, that's not right. One of the things about Scrum, it is really a good system, especially if you can execute it right. I know we're still a lot of people are still getting used to it and finding ways to make it better. And I think that 10 years from now, we're going to have entirely different discussions about Scrum than we are today, because we're going to find its weaknesses and find ways to fix them. One of the weaknesses I've seen in Scrum, and it's more of a theoretical than practical, because I've been actually when Scrum has now become really popular, I've been more on the academic side, so I'm getting more of the stories in and not living through the experiences anymore. But one of the problems I see is that we lose track of the long-range goals, because Scrum is focused on that next sprint. And that's the nature of it. That's the beauty of it, is you're thinking, what is the next sprint? What is the goal of the next sprint? But when you're doing that replanning, you should say also, when I'm doing this replanning, what are the impacts on my milestones downstream? Now, some places are probably doing that. I'm sure you make that mistake only once, right? That you suddenly realize you've got to alpha. Oh, wait a minute. You're not anywhere near alpha, but alpha is due today. And by the way, unless you are funding this project yourself, you're working on somebody else's dime. You have a requirement, first of all, to work within the constraints of your budget. And second of all, you have an obligation to spend, whoever's funding it, spend their money wisely and efficiently. So, because it's not like it's your money you're spending. So what you need to do is you need to keep track of the fact that you have a delivery date. And that's often that delivery date is based on when you think you can get it done. But it's also based on a budget, because if you go over, it's costing you more money. And that comes out of what? Comes out of your profits. So you need to keep an eye on that long range. What happens is when you take that short-sighted view, you have a tendency to make decisions based upon the next cycle, not on what happens long range. So you need to actually say, okay, we've got a decision to make here. What's the impact on the next sprint? And what's the impact on our milestones? And when you do that, then the Scrum system should work pretty well for you, because you'll be making some of the right decisions. All right, so next one, scheduling issues. Now here, maybe I'm going to come up with something that some of you haven't heard about, because this critical chain I'm going to talk about down here is relatively new. I've been exposed to it just recently. By the way, who here has heard of critical chain versus critical path? Whoa, I need to ask another question first. Who here knows what critical path is? I know some of you are bound to, but not everybody works with scheduling. Okay, so I'm going to briefly talk about critical path, because I want to talk about something that comes out of that. For those of you who already know, this is a good time to take a quick nap. So if you close your eyes, it'll be perfectly acceptable. In the critical path, really what that says, you've got a series of tasks that are all connected. And some of them can be done in parallel with others, but there's a path through the chain of work that is the minimum time you can get it done based on the estimations for each task. You can't do this one until this one, you can't start this one until this one is finished. And when you put them together and get them down to the minimum time, you may have tasks down here that we have what's called slack time, because it ends here, but you've got another 3 days before the thing that can't start until this one is done, before it really needs to start, because it's another task up here that won't be done until then. So you have that situation where any task that has slack time in it gets thrown out of the critical path. The critical path gives you the minimum time estimate of how long it's going to take you to get the project done. Now, Knowing that, you realize that in every task, typically, there is how long is it going to take, and then we put in a pad, right? Because we got an expected time, but we know life happens. So you put in a pad. And it may be double, it may be triple, it may be 50%, depends upon who you are and what you're doing. But there is a pad done in each one. So that's built into everything in the critical path. The trouble is, there is a psychological disadvantage of when you extend that, you put in that pad, even if the person who is doing the task is the one that gave you the estimate and they put in the pad, if it's a 2-day job and they've given themselves 4 days, at the end of 2 days, if they're almost done and they've got some things they can do to clean it up, they will continue working because they've got 4 days. And what typically happens is you do that, and then pretty soon you run into a task that it was supposed to take, you figured it'd take 2 days, you estimated 4 days, but it really takes 6 days because you ran into a problem you hadn't anticipated, and wham, your schedule is busted, and you don't make the schedule because it's in the critical path and everything else moves along, and everybody downstream is still taking up their time. So, and if you look at the numbers, schedules run long more often than they run short by a huge percentage. So, and that's because people will fill up the time. So when I was at EA, at one point I recognized that this was an issue, and I thought, well, I would love to have 2 schedules. One for my programmers and the people doing the work, and one for management. And the one for the people doing the work is, here's what I really expect it to take. And the ones for the managers is here, I'm taking that pad, and I'm doing the one with the pads in it, and I'm giving them that number. And this would be great, because now everybody would be working, the way they're supposed to, and trying to get the job done and not wasting too much time. And management wouldn't be on my back because, I'm breaking a milestone here or two, because I've got some flex time in there between what I'm telling one team and what I'm telling the other. But to make this work, I have to lie to management, and I have to lie to my production team. Never a good idea, even in the abstract, but it has a really, really fatal flaw. And that is, people are not stupid. Management is going to find out about my internal schedule, and my programming team is going to find out about my external schedule. So what am I going to get? I'm going to get my programmers working towards what they think is the real schedule, which is what I told the manager, and managers bugging me for the internal schedule because they know that's what I'm working towards. And now I'm damned if I do, damned if I don't. So it is, I still really haven't accomplished much. It turns out the critical chain approach, which I'll describe in just a minute, fixes that problem, and you don't have to lie to anybody. How critical chain works is you do the same thing you did before. You have these tasks. But instead of putting the pad in, you say, here's how long I expect it to take. Not too conservative, just somewhere in the Goldilocks zone, so to speak. So you put all these tasks in at realistic times. And then you figure what the pad would be, and you add all those pads up through what would be the critical path if you had one, if you're using critical path instead of critical chain. You add them all up, and you get one huge task that you put at the very end as a pad, and you cut it in half. And you cut it in half because, in theory, sometimes you're going to be under, sometimes you're going to be over. In fact, typically, because of the psychological effect, you're going to be there. But you're still going to be not probably need all that pad time. So what happens? Because people will sometimes make their dates. If they're realistic dates, they should make them 50% of the time. Depends on how good you are at estimating. So what happens now is when somebody busts a milestone, they realize, I expected it to be done this long. This is what I committed to. I didn't make it. So now there isn't this psychological thing saying, I've got time. There's this sense of urgency to kind of get it done quicker. But nobody panics because we have the pad down here. And what you do is you manage that pad. You're saying, okay, at certain times you should be certain places in this pad, and if you go over it, then you're running out of, that warns you that you're actually taking up more time than you anticipated, and you need to maybe rethink about moving your milestones, or take some other action. But you don't panic when you miss 1 or 2 milestones, because you just watch the pad. So long as you're under where you expect to be in the pad, you just keep moving forward. And then when you're done, if you've eaten up some of that pad time, you didn't finish on the date that you thought you were going to be done with the work, but you got done before the target date you had planned on doing. And it turns out that most of the research, and when I was reading through this, there wasn't a lot, but most of the research at that time said a large majority of these projects under this process come in on time or sometimes even under. And it's because now this is a different psychology. So you kind of get, it's almost like magic. What have we changed? We've just changed the psychology of the situation. And yet, it's making a real difference. So if you think that project management can't make a difference, well, then you probably never worked on a project that's gone south because you didn't manage it. But if you don't think that things like this can make a difference, they do. Sometimes little things make a big difference. So that is, kind of where we go with that. The last thing I'd like to say about that is about the scheduling. This is my last, bit of insight that I've had from the time I spent. And I also I saw this when I was working in the field. I see it even more among my students, and for an obvious reason, I tell you what it is. It's the whole idea of scheduling in the first place. You go to a programmer, because typically, most of you in your organizations, do you make up the deadlines, or do you go in and say, here's what we need to be done, tell me how long you think it's going to take? Most organizations I know actually go to, especially among the programmers, saying, here's what you need to do, how long you think it's going to take. And sometimes you negotiate the answer. But typically it's a negotiation. It's not, this is going to take 2 days, it's going to take 3 days. For, students and inexperienced programmers, people who haven't been in the field long, when they're asked to estimate how long something is going to take, there is a moment of panic that occurs. It's because, in their mind, somewhere out there in the world, maybe, on Google or in Wikipedia, somebody has a book of tasks that is exactly the task that they have to estimate. And there's a number in there, and it's 2.7 days. But they don't know the number. And whatever they give them, they feel like it's going to be wrong. And that model is completely, completely wrong. There is no book. There is no magic number. And it's going to be all over the map. And people who have been doing this for a while don't worry about it anymore because they just recognize that's the way it works. But when students first start, they have this feeling that somehow there's a magic number and that they're trying to guess what it is because they don't have the experience to know what it is. I run an experiment, well, not experiment, it's more of a kind of a lab in one of the classes to kind of get them over this. And what I do is I have 3 people come up to the whiteboard. And I say, okay, person A, you're going to come up with a number between 0 and 50. Person B, you're going to come up with a number between, person A comes up with a number between 50 and 100. Person B comes up with a number between 0 and 50. Person C has to subtract the lower number from the larger one. And you do that 10 times. Now wait, before you start, all the rest of the class and you guys up at the board, tell me, how long do you think this is going to take? So everybody puts in their, makes their bet, so to speak, and they put their number down, and we write the numbers down. And then we run the exercise. And it takes some amount of time. Everybody says, okay, number's all over, here's where it fell. Usually somewhere in between. I haven't had a time that I've run this yet that it has ever fallen outside the range. I said, all right, now we're going to do it again. 3 more people, but you saw what happened, you know the rules, and let's make another round of how long it's going to take. Well, the estimates, typically they don't go down to, most of my students are smart enough to recognize, probably was lucky last time, that something could happen. I'm going to think that maybe they could do it a little faster, especially now that they've seen it done. So they'll pick another number, and the numbers come in. The ranges aren't nearly as great, but there's a range. And then we run it again, and then a number comes up. And I say, okay, first of all, you've learned 2 lessons from this. A, experience on doing something gives you a better way of estimating. That's how you get good at estimating, is you just gain experience. And until you have experience, don't expect to be able to pull these numbers out, magically out of a hat. Second of all, there is no magic number. If I ran this exercise 5 or 6 times, they would fall in range. I'd get a curve, but they would be all over the place. And since in the game industry, we don't do things 100 times and get those numbers and say, okay, do it again, and we've got this, and we're going to tell you what the median is. You're doing things usually, similar things you've done before, but it's still different. So there is no curve to go to. You just have to go with your experience. And what you do is now your commitment is what this really is to this time is based on your experience and is partially based on how long you think it's going to take and partially it's a commitment to how long it's going to take you to do it. So it's part planning, part commitment. And that is one of those things I think if you've got people working for you who are inexperienced, you might take a little pressure off them by letting them know or just running this exercise if you need to so people don't get quite so paranoid about those numbers. But once again, they need to know they need to be responsible for those numbers. But over time, they'll get better. Any questions? Did I make my time? Yeah, I did. Like 2 minutes? Yeah.
As you make your document that you developed?
The technical design document?
Right.
Actually, that's EA property, although it is 15 years old, and I have shown it to my students. EA, when I was there again at EA.com, that was right around 2000, they were still using a variant of it. It had actually grown significantly. They had added more and more items to it. I think it actually got better. But it's an EA proprietary document. If sometime we got a chance, if I happen to have it on my system, I can say, yeah, here it is. But the real problem is, like I said before, it was a perfect document for EA. But for other organizations, there was stuff in there that we asked that you don't need to ask because you already know. There was some things we needed to know that, like the team. You don't need to document who your team is. That's documented someplace else if it's an in-house document. But when you're working third party and you're working for EA and we're responsible for kind of evaluating that was information we needed. So there was more in there than you'd need for an internal document. If you're looking like maybe for an internal guideline.
Right.
Yeah. So, but if you get a chance, grab me and over soda or something. I can tell you kind of some things that were in it.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. My experience, I find most people tend to underestimate tasks.
Oh yes.
Some people don't. Most people do underestimate. People seem to also hate to estimate times. It's almost like it'd be done. I'm not ex-creative, but dealing with creatives would be, it'd be done what we've done. And also, even upper management, you got the quality and time and the scope and whatnot, budget. But time is how important time is. Because if we didn't have time or estimates or deadlines, then we just kind of drift.
Yeah, forever.
Yeah.
Milestones because I only had an hour and I had to cut things. One of the things I didn't cover was the importance and value of milestones.
Yeah.
That their real goal is if you have a lot of them, early on, it's an early warning sign when you're slipping. But the other thing about estimates is that even though the very thing I told you about how people will say, I think it's going to take this long, and then they add a pad, it's almost universal. Especially when you're less experienced versus when you're more experienced. And you'd think it'd be the other way around until you stop and realize what's going on. That it's almost universal. People underestimate how long something is going to take. And that's because in their mind they're running through a model. Okay, this is 50 lines of code. I've written 50 lines of code. I can do that in 2 hours. And then that they're not thinking the fact that, well, before I do that, I've got to go back and research, how is DirectX going to handle, or how do I do the renderer? Or how does DirectX handle this problem? Or I'm going to have to use this sound library I've never used before. And they're not taking into consideration things like research. They're not taking into consideration things like, hey, they've got to read their email. They've got to attend a meeting. And so there's just a ton of things you don't take into consideration. They don't show up in the formula. In theory, they show up in the pad. But in fact, it's amazing how much time is spent doing things that you don't think of when you're just looking at, especially as a programmer. Artists have a different problem, but it's similar. It's different than the programmers only think about, well, so many lines of code. Artists think, I've just got to do this drawing. I've done drawings before. But there's kind of a creative process that's got to go on, and that is pretty hard to predict. And often artists miss that. One of the things I didn't talk about is at one point, before I became an engineer, I actually was a cartoonist. So I'm not passing myself off as an artist. Turned out I should have been an engineer. Made the right job there. I actually did some cartooning, so I kind of understand the art side too.
You mentioned if you're writing design documents that no one's reading, you should stop writing those. Don't you see any value in just the collation of your own thoughts by translating it from your brain to paper just through the act of writing?
Okay, busted. So I am talking about you don't want to write documents. You don't want to create information for other people that isn't being used. But if the part of your design process, part of your creative process is that you need to do certain things that end up in printed documents, drawings, whatever it is, then for God's sakes, yes, do it. It's part of your design process. It's part of your process. But typically, people will write a design document. They want to really make it look good. They spend extra time on it. That costs time. They want to make it sound good. They get flowery. And then it begins to muddy up the actual communications because they've forgotten who it is they're talking to or who they're making this for. So there is that inefficiency. That's what you want to stop. Don't stop. don't stop writing novels. Don't stop making up stories. Don't stop writing your own internal design documents so you document your own thoughts. If you're like me, I have a great thought today, tomorrow. If I haven't written it down, I forgot I even had it. But I actually had that experience happen. It's a little scary, but I'm getting old. I guess it should be okay. I went through something. I go on walks. I had these great ideas. I document them, and then I put them in a file. And one of my systems crashed. And it took me about a year before I recovered the files from it. In there were the files from these notes. I went through them and said, look at this. Hey, this is a great idea. I wonder who wrote this. And I realized it was one of my own journals. Didn't even recognize it. So this does happen. And sometimes the ideas come and go. So it's good. Documentation is not bad even for yourself. But the focus was, I didn't want to muddy up the water. Focus is, don't generate stuff for other people that you don't need to.
Back to padding and on estimations. So are the pads being generated by the people who are also making their own estimation? Is there have you seen it in use, we know our team generally, on average, we need this kind of pad for our team?
Okay, so there's a couple of answers to that question, one of which I have to kind of talk about from a more hypothetical viewpoint because I haven't done Scrum, but the other one from real experience and having gone through this. So normally, in my experience in the past, the estimations have come, and including the pads. When you get an estimate, that includes a pad that's put in by the person who's going to do it. So that's where that comes from. Although, if I'm coming to you and I say, I need to have you do, here's the goal, here's what I need to have done, here's a class, here's all the functions that need to be done, here's what happens. We had that discussion. How long? And you say 3 weeks. And I look at you and say, are you out of your mind? This shouldn't take you more than a week. That's the beginning of a negotiation. Probably not the best way to begin a negotiation. But it is if you really feel like you need to get this person down, I guess. But it's the beginning of a negotiation, so you negotiate it to a point of something you could both live with. And then, so that happens too. So in that case, the pad comes from a negotiation. Now,